Hello, dear friends, and welcome to another online webinar organized by the Wilfred Martin Center. We are the official think tank and political foundation of the European People's Party in Brussels. My name is Dimitar Lilkov. I'm a research officer at the Martin Center, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. A webinar which cannot come at a better time, given the importance of the topic. Today we'll be talking about Hong Kong and the attempt of the Chinese Communist Party to undermine the autonomy and judicial independence of Hong Kong. Almost a month ago, China proposed to impose a new national security law in Hong Kong, which would curtail and severely limit the fundamental rights of the population of the autonomous region. China's efforts to impose this legislation, which is still not fully in force, so China's efforts to impose this legislation are clearly not in conformity with the Hong Kong Basic Law and also in clear violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1994, which remains legally binding for both parties under international law. The international community itself and dozens of liberal democracies globally have condemned China's conduct and see this act as a possibility and a threat against Hong Kong's autonomy and the civil liberties of its citizens. In today's webinar, we have at least two main goals. First, to understand what is actually happening on the ground in Hong Kong and how to interpret the aggressive and unscrupulous conduct of the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to national security law. And secondly, we will address how should the European Union and the international community respond in order to prevent this unlawful act. We will have a webinar discussion for the following 60 minutes. Most of it will be a panel discussion among our three panelists. And the last 15 or 20 minutes, I would like to devote for a Q&A with the online audience, with all of you. So please feel free to pose your questions in the Facebook comment section below. Also address your questions on Twitter. I'm extremely grateful that today we're joined by a fantastic panel of experts who have key insights on the topic. First, let me introduce our president, Mikuláš Dzurinda, who is the president of the Wilfred Martin Center. He's also a former Prime Minister of Slovakia and former Foreign Minister of the country. Mikuláš Dzurinda has an extensive track record in European affairs and international diplomacy. President Dzurinda, it's a pleasure. We are also joined by Miriam Lexman. She is a member of the European Parliament, part of the EPP group, and also member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. Ms. Lexman is also a co-chair of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, a recently formed alliance, which brings together legislators from at least 8 parliaments globally. Ms. Lexman, it's an honor to have you. And last but not least, we're joined by Brian Lung. We will have an extremely important contribution from Mr. Lung, who is a PhD student in the University of Washington in the States and Hong Kong democracy activist who's been vocally engaged in the recent democratic protests in Hong Kong since 2019. So without further ado, I would like to kick off the debate. President Dzurinda, what do you make of the situation in Hong Kong and how should the EU respond?
Thank you very much, Dimitar. Thank you for taking this initiative, and I would like to greet my colleagues in the panel. Really substantial issue. Look, I believe that the national security law, which has been adopted recently, is a part of a wider mosaic, how China is doing its political business in these times. It is the Chinese global behavior which matters and which is problematic. Outward China, but also inward China. We observe that the that China is struggling for global hegemony and dominance. We notice for a longer time that this is assertiveness, but even more aggressiveness, which dominates Chinese politics. We saw it when it comes to the political pressure on some countries. We see it when it comes to the classical tactics, divide et impera, divide and rule. China is trying to divide EU institutions from a member foundation for member states of the European Union. China is trying to draw a dividing line between Germany and the other European countries. China is trying to pretend that it is economically very friendly on one side, but on the other side, if China invests into Piraeus port, then China is coming with political pressure, which forbids to adopt a unanimous political declaration related to human rights violation in China. I would continue with the lack of transparency, with playing level field, with level playing field, with discrimination of foreign investors, and many other issues. But what is dangerous and disturbing is also the fact that China is stepping up its pressure on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, on different regional but also political minorities in China. And this is just not acceptable. This is dangerous. Trying for dominance and hegemony is legitimate, but the means how to do it are not. And this is why I am happy that the EU or Western community in these days is more united, not enough united, but more united than before when it comes to our reaction also related to national security law. This is the first part of your question or of the problem. The second part is also very important and maybe more difficult how to respond, how to react on this situation. In this first part, I will be very brief because I believe that next time or in the second part of our debate, I have a chance to develop some ideas more on detail. Look, we have three possibilities. The first, to be even more vocal when it comes to problems, difficulties, or political behavior of China. We are more vocal today in these days than before, but I have a feeling that not enough. This is the first. We should criticize every violation of human rights, every violation of generally accepted rules. And we should act also as the EU institutions, member states, but also political parties, but also civic society in the EU. This is the first possibility. And the second is to defend fundamental human rights much boldly than in the past. And last but not least, there is also a potential possibility to impose sanctions. Maybe political sanctions, maybe economic sanctions. This is a very sensitive, very tricky issue, but such a possibility is also at our disposal. I would stop here for the moment.
Thank you very much, President. Just a very quick follow-up. You've outlined the EU's position, your opinion here. What do you think about the transatlantic angle on this issue? How should we cooperate with the US on this?
There is no doubt when I mentioned that China is trying to promote divide et impera, divide and rule tactics, that the country is trying to implement such an approach also vis-a-vis United States and the EU, trying to describe Europe as much more friendly than that Americans. This is a trap. For us, for European, this is a huge trap. Not everything is good in the United States in these days. My basic response to your question is that we should go hand in hand with Americans. We should coordinate our approach. In these times, it is a bit difficult because President Trump is promoting unilateral approach instead of consultation, coordination, mutual understanding. This is a problem. But the problem of these days, not a fundamental problem. Fundamentally, we, with the United States or this transatlantic axis, must be strong and our approach should be coordinated and united. If we operate together, the impact of our operation is much, much higher than our individual actions, even though I don't want to underestimate the influence or the impact of the United States as such.
Thank you for the clear statement on that. I would like to give the floor to Member of the European Parliament, Miriam Lexman. Miriam, where do you stand on this and what's the Parliament's take here?
Thank you very much. First of all, I thank you to the Wilfred Martin Center to organize this event because it's a very timely event and it's very good, as my former Prime Minister said, that we have to be vocal, and to be vocal also means to raise awareness because obviously then more allies can be vocal. I'll take a couple of steps back and bring us 6-7 years ago when I was still a director for the European programs at the International Republican Institute, and we started to work on the issue of disinformation and cyber security and cyber threats. We managed to create an alliance which was aware of the threats coming from Russia. But unfortunately, it was nearly impossible to bring the awareness that similar threats are coming from China. We were practically, because the Chinese way of interfering was much more sophisticated, much more subtle, and much more, I would say, wise. But unfortunately, this pandemic has brought us and opened the reality when we had a series of events which were a kind of strong wake-up call, when we had China trying to influence the EU versus disinfo report of the European Union, China or the EU ambassador agreeing to the pressure of China to censor the letter of EU ambassadors to the people of China. We have information that our diplomats, the EU diplomats, do not have human rights issues, and the case of Hong Kong in their notes when they are dealing with Chinese diplomats and preparing the investment deal. So these are all strong wake-up calls when we realize that we not only have to be more vocal, as Mr. Dzurinda said, but also, and I'm going to rephrase his words, we have to be more aware that our values are actually our strength and not our weakness. We have to be more principled in dealing with China, because otherwise it's going to backlash. The Article 21 of the EU Treaty stipulates very clearly that the values which brought the European Union together should be the values which should be present in our foreign affairs. And the kind of series of events I mentioned at the beginning obviously show the opposite. So we see that the situation is very serious, especially now with Hong Kong, which will be a huge loss for the West if we will allow Hong Kong to practically the kind of one country, two system law be breached by China, while the international community is a guarantor of this law and of the freedoms of people of Hong Kong. So having said that, I see that the kind of alliance to have a more principled approach to China and to defend the rights and freedoms of people in Hong Kong is growing. We have seen over 900 parliamentarians from 43 countries joining the letter of Lord Pattern and Sir Rifkind. Now we see a very strong resolution which was passed last week by the European Parliament, which practically is calling to bring China to the International Court of Justice, is calling on China to release all the detainees and all the political prisoners or young people who were detained because they were practically exercising their right to demonstrate and to go to the streets when they see that the countries or their own freedoms are being curbed. The resolution also very clearly says that the Article 21 has to be present in our international treaties, and particularly in the future international treaties or free trade agreements with China. So I think we see that people are starting to be aware that the future of Hong Kong is really also our own future. As Dimitar has mentioned, we have created this IPAC, Interparliamentary Alliance on China. I have the privilege to co-chair it on behalf of the European Parliament with Mr. Bütikofer, a German Green member of the Parliament, who is actually a chair of the delegation to China. This alliance has a few pillars or a few main ideas to support, which is to first uphold human rights, second, promote free trade, and this is a very strong issue that we have lots of trade agreements with China, but the problem is that we can hardly call it a free trade when our companies are trying to adhere to certain international standards, which are being constantly breached by the companies of China, which we know that these companies are mainly directly run by the Communist Party because it's a communist regime. And of course, I mean, we are trying in IPAC to strengthen the security vis-a-vis China. So these are the main issues. And yeah, I will probably stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Miriam, for this opening. A very quick follow-up. You mentioned the parliamentary resolution calling for potential action in front of the International Court of Justice. But some people would say that international law is not enough. We've seen many instances where such specific cases were not really handled well, or it took a really long time. So President Zurinda also mentioned sanctions. What's our toolkit here when we talk about the EU? Apart from resolutions, apart from discussions, how far should we go? What do you think?
I clearly support the idea of trying to think of sanctions. We know, and actually this is also in the resolution, sanctions are mentioned in the resolution. Especially, I would think that we need to be very strategic with sanctions, because sanctions, I mean, have a long history. Many people are opposing sanctions because they believe that they are not useful, that they don't change, that they only harm the poor people practically in those countries, in those regimes who are already suppressed by their own leadership. And that's why we have to be absolutely strategic, that we will pick the kind of main responsible communist leaders for certain breaches. And that I believe that this is very strategic. I will tell one story, which I think is a very powerful story. And Mr. Khodorkovsky, when he was in jail very close to the Finnish border, he said that the individual sanctions imposed on Russian leaders actually helped him to be treated better in the prison, because the prison guard was afraid that they will be also put on the list and they will be not able to do their shopping in Finland. So, and I think this is an argument to those people who say that sanctions are actually harming only the poor people, that we can say that no, sanctions, if we target rightly the sanctions against people who will be involved in putting in jail young people standing on the streets of Hong Kong, the people will probably think twice if they are going to beat them in the prison or if they are going to detain them. So I think this is a very strategic approach. And I have forgotten to mention one thing. The resolution of the European Parliament also calls that the UN will establish a special envoy and a special rapporteur on Hong Kong. And bringing it to your question, Dimitar, if UN will be more vocal on Hong Kong, I think this is another platform where we can achieve something. And yesterday, 8 former envoys of the UN actually call on the Secretary General of the UN to set up this position of a special envoy for Hong Kong. So I think, and I hope, that the international community will act united, and we will use all possible means, including sanctions and especially the targeted sanctions, in order to put pressure on China to adhere to the international laws.
Thank you for this comprehensive reply. I really want to involve as well Brian now. Again, Brian, thanks for joining us, even though there's a substantial time difference between Brussels and the States. Brian, what's happening on the ground in Hong Kong? What's the state of play when we talk about this national security law? Can you walk us through it?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again. I really want to express my gratitude for being able to speak here with Mr. Derrida and Ms. Lesman. And I'm extremely grateful for the chance to be able to share what's going on in Hong Kong. So without further ado, let me shed some light on the national security law. I think the national security law is really a fundamental undermining of the one country, two system and the judicial independence that is guaranteed in the basic law. The national security law, on the one hand, it involves the criminalization of certain activity that involves, secession, subversion of the state, and also, collusion with foreign interferences, right? So, for example, the very conversation we are having today could be seen as evidence against myself or other activists who engage in international advocacy and exchange with other countries and peoples, right? So I think they really want to criminalize, not only protests. They already say that, protesting against the Hong Kong government could be also seen as a subversion of state power. And on the other hand, our effort in terms of raising the awareness globally and asking for concerns and institutional change in the global, community. So I think they're really trying to ramp up their legal tool to kind of repress the activists and other NGO or INGO or the press. So this is the first layer of the law. But I think the second layer, which involves much more fundamental change, is that China is going to set up a direct organ, a direct agency in Hong Kong, which is called Office of the National Security Commissioners. And this agency basically is vast with the power of legal jurisdiction. It can actually arrest people. It can actually trial people. And it's also a possibility that Hong Kong people could be extradited back to China for the trial and the prosecution. So what we have seen before on news, such as Guo Minhai from Sweden, a bookseller who was kidnapped from Thailand and adopted back to China, now serving a sentence in China. Or another less well-known example, Simon Zhang, a former UK consulate worker in Hong Kong, who was adopted in China and basically tortured, who is now seeking a political asylum in UK. Those cases will not be under the table anymore. They will be legally allowed to do so. Basically, people working in NGOs, INGOs, press, or the activist circle, they could actually be snatched from Hong Kong and be extradited back to China. So this is extremely worrying. And the law also say that actually, if there is a conflict between local law and that national security law, that law will prevail. And who interpret the law? It is the National People Congress, which is the Chinese legislature, who interpret the law. In other words, basically, National People Congress, the legislature of China, can intervene, interpret the law, and veto and say this is the Hong Kong local law contravene our national security law, right? So this is another layer of the fundamental undermining of our judicial independence. And the last point I want to make, the chief executive has a lot of power in picking the judge, who will be the judge serving in those cases related to national security law. So this gives another reason to protest against this, because it violates the idea of separation power, where the chief executive could basically handpick who will be the judge of the trials, right? So again, what we see now is a fundamental, destruction of the principle of one country, two system, and also the judicial independence of Hong Kong. And it also involves and concerns international community, as there are multiple consulate in Hong Kong, INGOs present in Hong Kong, international press and business circle in Hong Kong. They will also be a target of the national security law in future. So I can't stress enough how pervasive, how dangerous this law can be once implemented. And actually, it will be implemented soon, like next week, according to rumor. And lastly, I'll just speak a little bit about the the situation on the ground in terms of the protester. As we all know, it's now the first anniversary of the movement since 2019, and 7,000 protesters have been arrested. 600 of them have been charged with rioting. And rioting is a law that is a colonial legacy coming from the British era, and is extremely draconian in terms of repressing protesters. And many young people actually have been sentenced to almost like 10 years in Hong Kong for protesting, right? And 600 people have been charged with rioting. And I think they are using all possible legal means to kind of stop people from going to protest again. For example, COVID-19, they have legislated a series of public health regulations, and they have used those regulations to stop people from protesting. And it's extremely dire in terms of human rights situation in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong police basically is unaccountable in our current system. They practice, unstopped stop and search. Once you go out of the metro station, you will basically see police who will stop you and search you and try to stop you from protesting. And one staggering fact is they actually have increased their budget by 25% after 2019. And the contrast, you can think about US protests where they actually are talking about police defunding and regulating the police and make it more accountable. Whereas in Hong Kong, a growingly authoritarian regime now are actually ramping up their police, apparatuses to repress people. So in terms of human rights situation and the protest dynamic, it's extremely dire. I think a winter of civil society in Hong Kong is coming. And that's why at this point, I think international concern and a united effort in pushing back against China's encroachment is extremely important, because we might not be able to see another time where Hong Kong people can protest and another time where the world actually can voice out their concerns, right? So lastly, I'll just echo what all the other panelists say. It's extremely important for the EU and other multilateral organizations such as UN to take a concerted effort in terms of supporting Hong Kong and giving tangible pressure on China. And I really look forward to the discussion, but I'll just end on a personal note. I was a law student in Hong Kong, and I can't stress how much I've read about European Court of Human Rights judgment, and it has been a source of legal doctrine in Hong Kong, but also a source of inspiration about how we should practice human rights as the highest ideals, right? And I think EU in future will not be just seen on the legal textbook, but will also be seen as Hong Kong as a companion, as an ally to Hong Kong people in foreign affairs, in multilateral organization. So I really am happy to be able to join here and speak to European audience, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us that in your view, Europe is not only normative power or a textbook, but actually can be a global ally. Brian, thank you for leading us through this very complex question, reminding us that this is an actual threat. National security law is an actual threat to Hong Kong autonomy and judicial independence. But a very quick follow-up, you mentioned COVID-19. What's the impact of the virus, of the general mood of the democracy movement in Hong Kong? If you can compare the movement in 2019, you were a vocal supporter and clearly involved in it. Can you compare it with the situation right now? And is Beijing taking really this as an advantage to serve its cause, because the virus, the outbreak is still there?
Absolutely. I think Beijing is very sophisticated in picking the right time to kind of ramp up their repression in Hong Kong during COVID-19, right? Domestically, I think people are actually, they have recovered from the pandemic, trying to see opportunity to mobilize once again, right? But as I've discussed, the Hong Kong government retained most of the public health regulations, especially, you cannot have public gathering, in outside area, and they have used the police to basically forestall any mobilization effort, right? So I think civil society are actually looking at every opportunity to mobilize themselves, but the legal tools and the police apparatuses are way too strong for the protester to, mobilize once again in a large scale, right? But July 1st might be another turning point where we can see and other mobilization. And lastly, on the other hand, I think Beijing also took advantage of the global pandemic crisis where countries around the world are very busy dealing with their domestic health issues, and maybe there is less discussion around foreign affairs. So I think Beijing is very sophisticated in picking the right time to take advantage of the pandemic.
Thank you for this. Let's elevate discussion a bit more on the international level. President Zurinda, I would like to give you the floor and follow up on this angle. Has the international community been asleep because of COVID-19? Has it been distracted because of COVID-19? And what do you think will be the reaction? Can we expect actually joint action and better cooperation next couple of weeks?
I would say that realizing the seriousness of COVID-19 issue, I was pretty surprised that especially the EU institutions and EU member states, but also civic organizations were not sleepy when it comes to Hong Kong or China in wider sense. Look, I have been reading for several weeks how heavily was Josep Borrell, the High Commissioner, the High Representative for foreign policy, European foreign policy, how heavily he was under pressure. He was drilled in the Foreign Policy Committee in the European Parliament. Miriam can tell us more, but he was drilled also at the plenary. And Miriam mentioned the European Parliament resolution. This Monday, European Commission President, Madame von der Leyen, and the President of the European Council, Mr. Michel, they spoke to Chinese President and Prime Minister. I was reading that they were very blunt, protesting against national security law, against what is happening in Hong Kong or in China in wider space. And the reaction of Chinese President and Prime Minister, their reaction was very typical. Nobody should interfere into Chinese domestic issues, but we need to respond. This is not basic human rights. This is not an internal or domestic issue of a single state. Basic human rights is, I would say, a general, fundamental, or universal value which has to be respected, also in China. So I don't think so that we were sleepy. I am happy that I can read in Politico almost every morning something dealing with China or Hong Kong, dealing with reality, telling us that the European External Action Service has been under pressure because European diplomats agreed that China altered the text before publishing in Chinese press, dealing with this issue of national security law. I can read about the case on Paris or in the Czech Republic, when the boss of the national parliament is preparing his trip to Taiwan, and he's occurring under huge pressure from the Chinese embassy. We can read all these things, and this is good. But also party level and civic society level is important. Party level. The EPP presidency statement on China and the situation in Hong Kong, which has been adopted on June the 11th, is very good. I was there. I put my amendment, which speaks about people arrested in Hong Kong a few weeks ago. And by the way, also Martin Center, I am glad, Dimitar, that we have a fantastic friend in Hong Kong speaking to us, talking to us today, having a unique opportunity to listen to what is happening on the ground. It is a clear demonstration that also civic society organizations can contribute to that positive development. So I don't think that we sleep. We can do more. We can do more. Miriam spoke about personal or targeting sanctions. I was mentioning also political, not only economic sanctions. The US is dealing with this in these days. I was reading yesterday that there is a proposal already now in the US Congress to adopt legislation dealing with these personal or targeting sanctions. So US is ahead a bit again. We can do more, but I believe that especially in the last 2 years, we are on the right track, also in Europe.
Thank you. Miriam, I would like to involve you a bit more, and let's focus on China's side on this and Chinese tactics in this issue. You have a track record in dealing with disinformation, cybersecurity. What are the risks when we talk about disinfo and cybersecurity here? Do you think that this is a major part of Beijing's tactics when it comes to Hong Kong? And how can we tie it with our own backyard in the EU, bearing in mind that we've also been suffering from heavy Chinese disinfo campaigns recently?
Yeah, thank you very much. For sure, what's happening now in relation to Hong Kong is something China is kind of relying on. The basis they were preparing for years when we were still sleeping assured that our relationship with China is promoting in a long run human rights in China because economic involvement leads into improvement of the human rights records in the regimes. When we were doing polling in the International Republican Institute, for me it was very, very surprising to see that 5-6 years ago and until now, we have realized that people in the member states of the European Union were calling or were practically prioritizing the relationship with China, that they believe that their governments have to increase economic relations with China because that will bring well-being to them. And I was thinking where this comes from, because obviously I don't think that people in Czech Republic and Slovakia will just, without being exposed to certain kind of information, will change their mind and would say, we don't want our government to be only improving relations with the US, with the EU, with Germany and the classical partners or within the V4, but we would like them to look into the relationship with China or invest into the relationship with China. So obviously the exposition of the citizens to this kind of information was coming from somewhere, and then we tried to track it and we realized that there were lots of PR articles in our media promoting the investments or sometimes fake investments, because often that was the case, that China was offering financial support or financial investments, which never happened, but they managed to made a huge coverage in the especially local media that this is something coming from China as a help to build kindergartens, roads, infrastructure. So we were exposed to this kind of information or disinformation, already for some years. Obviously, during COVID pandemics, it started to be very obvious because it started to be more severe, more I would say, explicit that this is a disinformation. It's not only kind of genuine article about Chinese interest to invest. Mikuláš Dzurinda was talking also about the civil society. And for me, this is very important. Yes, the civil society, the watchdogs, the human rights watchdogs are active. But because the citizens' approach so far was kind of reluctant, or I would say supportive of investment and economic ties with China, the civil society and some governments were practically unable to have stronger policies. But I think that now is the U-turn, and we have to use this U-turn and be more principled. And the thing is, what we have to also stipulate is that we, first of all, as Mikuláš rightly said, we are responsible for promoting human rights and safeguarding human rights all around the world, because this is our human obligation, and obligation as the EU as a power. But on the other hand, the Sino-British Treaty is lodged with the UN. So there are also legal consequences and legal kind of our legal rights we have to fulfill vis-a-vis the people in Hong Kong. And I would say maybe final point is that when we see the increasing breaches of human rights in China, because for as I said before, for some years we believe that our investment and trade with a totalitarian regime will inevitably change the regime into democracy. We realized and we learned this lesson hard already with Russia, that this is not the case. Despite of knowing that this is not the case, we are still turning our blind eye on the violations of human rights in China, which is actually increasing. I would say that our economic involvement is partially being complicit to the human rights breaches in Hong Kong, as well as in mainland China, and I would even say even more explicit example is the organ harvesting, that we know that China is harvesting organs from political prisoners, which is selling to Western countries, to the hospitals. So this is clear involvement in the human rights situation in China. And I think precisely here is the role of the governments and of the civil society to act and to be more vocal. And so far, and this is my final point, so far the European Union, as Mikuláš Dzurinda rightly portrayed, that the union started to be more vocal and they started to be aware. But I'm afraid that we need to work on the member states, because when there was a Foreign Affairs Council, the last one discussing the Hong Kong situation, the situation was not so clear. Member states were not able to even make a common statement. So I think this is where our role now lies with, that we have to really start to work clearly with the member states and give them arguments, give them reasons, also reasons related to the security, which is related to the 5G network and other security threats, which we have to be aware, and member states have to be aware, because they actually still hold the main instruments in their own hands in terms of foreign activities and actions of the EU.
Thank you for this really comprehensive reply. Brian, turning again to you, one quick question from my side, and I'll be slowly starting to involve people from the audience and our online web chat. So my first question to you is the following. We're talking about this notorious Sino-British Declaration. Is the UK, how strong should the UK's reaction be in this issue? We've seen already a pledge from the British Prime Minister for potential visa waivers for Hong Kong citizens. Will this actually apply pressure to China, or maybe it will do more damage than good? What do you think about this? This is my first question. And my second one, comes from Tommy Huchtan, and our executive director. What do you think is happening in China when we talk about the coronavirus? Do you think the COVID-19 situation is settled in China, or maybe this will still have an impact on Beijing's future actions, and it will preoccupy China in the near future?
Right. The first question, I think UK absolutely has a special historical responsibility, especially in terms of Hong Kong, due to our colonial relationship. And I think we appreciate what UK government has done recently by, making the immigration policy more favorable to Hong Kong people. But we believe it's not enough, because, in addition to providing a safety boat or a mechanism for people such as asylum seeker to more easily enter UK, is obviously welcome, and it helps the movement in terms of maintaining our longevity and people freedoms. But I think UK, we really hope that UK can take a more proactive approach in directly countering China's pressure. And in Hong Kong recently, a bank that is international based basically was forced to plead allegiance to the national security law and say that I support the national security law. The point is, actually, China's practice is not only targeting protesters on the street, but also multinational corporation. And given how much UK or EU have a business, presence in Hong Kong, I think those practices will eventually spill over, and Europe or UK companies one day have to face that direct political pressure that we're facing now. So I think it's actually in the interest of UK to take a much more proactive approach in countering that authoritarian practice of coming from China. So that's the first point. And I think the second point, I think coronavirus situation in China scholars still debate about it, right? But the general consensus seems to be as well contained within certain cities of origin, right? Other cities seem to have reignite their economic engine and try to get back to normal life. But it's hard to say. There might be a second wave coming in certain cities, but we should not underestimate how robust the Chinese authoritarian system could be, especially in terms of crisis and mobilizing, the people. So again, I think China is taking advantage of this time where we are still thinking, what should we do? How should we deal with our domestic crisis, and taking advantage of this moment. But in future, I think, especially given the moment of the first anniversary in Hong Kong, given it will be, on July 1st, the transfer of sovereignty from UK to China, it was a Memorial Day. Given how significant and symbolic this period of time is, I think China will ramp up the repression measure and try to basically forestall any mobilization in Hong Kong. So I think that in the summer, we should expect much more aggressive mood coming from China.
That's a clear statement coming from Brian Lung. We have some very engaging and interesting questions from the audience. Let me start with the first one, which is addressed to Mikuláš Dzurinda and also the other panelists. Germany is taking over the presidency of the Council of the EU, and given their quote-unquote political leadership style, can we expect a bit more assertiveness in the Germans' approach towards China? For example, matters of trade, human rights, protection, EU companies, and Hong Kong. President Dzurinda, German presidency, are we going to see more assertiveness from Berlin?
Yes, I hope so. I hope so, because the situation is really serious. And because, if I am not mistaken, there is a special meeting, EU-China, which has been postponed, but which should take place during the German presidency. It was postponed to November or December, if I am not mistaken. And on one side, I have very strong understanding that, especially for passenger car industries and some other industries, China is and will stay a very attractive market, no doubt about that. But on the other side, the level of understanding what Chinese behavior means for the West, including Germany, is so high that I strongly believe that our position will be stronger or more assertive, as it was mentioned in the question. And I would build our position on the protection of basic human rights. I would build our position on the insistence or positive approach towards legally binding international treaties, such as Sino-British Joint Declaration is. So I strongly believe, firstly, that our European position will be united, and secondly, will be bold and stronger than in the past. But as Miriam has indicated, we need to work very patiently, also with member states, to be able to speak with one voice when it comes to China.
Miriam, German presidency, how high should be our hopes?
I would say that we see already now a kind of slow change of the German culture. I would say maybe thinking time, I would call it maybe this way, because there was some kind of like a silence coming during the COVID. There was no strong statements coming from Germany, but I believe that this is indicating that they are maybe changing the policy, which so far was based on the let's support the economic exchange, let's support trade deals, let's support trade, because that will inevitably lead to a change. But I hope and I believe that there is a change coming soon. And I hope that there will be a more principled approach to trade. Human rights will be part of any trade deals, and there will be clear statements coming from the German presidency about the human rights breaches and situation, including the situation in Hong Kong. I also hope, because we are talking about human rights, and I forgot to mention one thing, the US is able to come up with the targeted sanctions because they already have their Magnitsky Act. But we still don't have the EU version, which is being in the making, but it's not finalized. So I really hope that the German presidency will be able to finalize the Magnitsky Act version, or EU version of the Magnitsky Act, because that will also be able to make us stronger vis-à-vis China in terms of the pressure on the human rights situation, and then targeting sanctions and economic sanctions as well. So, and the final thing I would like to mention is security issue, because I think this debate actually already started in Germany and inside of the CDU, when we saw two blocks. I mean, a block of politicians and political leaders who said that 5G is, I mean, if Huawei will get the contract to build 5G, that this is a security threat. We saw a bloc which was defensive of Huawei and China building it. And I think that probably this balance will change now when many other issues were revealed. So I hope that the German presidency will be more stronger on the security threats coming from China and help to unite the European Union to react to that.
Thank you. Brian, maybe in 30 seconds or less, what's your opinion? How is Germany seen in Hong Kong, given its economic relationship with China? What's your views?
I mean, I think the perception of Hong Kong people about Germany is ambivalent, right? I think Germany has not taken a very explicit and unequivocal position on Hong Kong. There are certain occasions in where they express concern, but we have yet to see a concerted effort, especially under the leadership of Germany, coming out from Europe, a very strong pushback against China, right? So I think hopefully, Germany is gonna, really take up its leadership in terms of advocating and especially given how much economic tie it has with China. And, we should not allow, countries to engage again with China economically without holding it accountable to international promises and without holding it accountable to universal values, right? So we hopefully could see more action coming out from Germany.
We have two more questions, which are very interesting. I would like to bundle them. I guess they are for our European panelists, but feel free to jump in, all of you. Question coming from Hong Kong. I think EU politicians know more about the danger of China, but how can the EU reverse the course when our ports are already in Chinese hands, many companies rely on Chinese exports, and many young people in Europe are using TikTok, the notorious Chinese app? Will there be a sufficient public support for a more aggressive support towards China, given all of these developments in Europe? And another question also coming from Hong Kong, it's a shorter one. What is the EPP's position on adding human rights when we talk about comprehensive agreements on investment and on trade? Should we bundle investment and trade with human rights? If anybody will want to jump in on this is mainly for our European panelists, but of course, floor is open. President Zurinda, yeah.
If I may to start, I have a hope. I have a hope that the process which I followed during the past 2 years will continue. And if the pressure of Chinese authorities, the pressure of the Communist Party of China will grow, I believe that the reaction of Western community, including the EU, will grow as well. This is my hope, and I will do my best, also from the position of our NGO, but I am invited also on personal basis to attend EPP presidencies. And I was very happy that when I put my proposal to amend our EPP presidency declaration, my amendment has been adopted unanimously without any major discussions or hesitation. So I have the hope that the level of sensitivity in favor of Chinese freedom fighters, I would say, is much higher than, for instance, 2 years ago when we believed, as Miriam described rightly, that China is not so dangerous as the Russia or some other authoritarian regimes. It was the question number one. The second is a bit more complicated. Whether should we connect these two dimensions or areas? I would like to be honest, I am not sure. I am not sure because on one side, we have to be principled. On the other side, we need to keep communication with China and to talk to Chinese authorities. Look, this is absolutely clear that it would be good if China is joining us to shoulder its part of responsibility, for instance, for environmental issues. Without China, the impact of our effort will be much, much lower. And it is very easy to decouple somebody or to alienate the country. But from midterm or long-term perspective, it is a bit contradictory. So I would maybe follow two ways. The first, to normalize economic relations, which is the goal of this investment agreement, to a level playing field, apart from other things, and at the same time, parallelly, to fight for the protection of universal human rights. It doesn't mean that we should follow the way which I followed many years ago, that we were afraid to criticize Chinese authorities in the past because we have a big business. It is not allowed anymore. So if it is acceptable for Chinese authority that we will negotiate business, but at the same time, we will be under heavy critics because of our internal behavior, for us, it should be acceptable. I would combine these two issues.
Miriam, is there public support for this given Chinese economic footprint in Europe? In 1 minute, please, if you can. We'll run a bit of time.
I will not repeat what Mikuláš has said because I agree to a large extent. The only thing I would maybe stress and include into what he said, I mean, we cannot now say like, okay, if human rights are not completely adhered in China, we are not doing any trade deals because we have already lots of trade contracts and they will run further. So we have to talk to a country which has a large impact on our own businesses. So the kind of like complete closure and building a wall, it's obviously not even possible now. But where we have to also put a very strong focus on is actually not only the human rights. I mean, especially, we have to be more vocal, put it in all treaties and try to really make pressure on the human rights issue. But we have to also make pressure on the adherence to the international business deals and treaties and laws, because we see China is stealing intellectual property, China is misusing its own or dominance vis-a-vis our companies. And I think we have to be more strict there because that will help us. If we will track every of the breaches and make pressure on China, that will help us to set the business ties in order.
Thank you very much for this. A final word to Brian. There's lots of comments online in support of your cause and you personally. Very quick words, a few words to Brian from our comments. Many thanks for speaking to us. I look forward to welcoming you back in our home city. Our heart and spirit are with you, buddy. Maybe 30 seconds closing words, Brian.
Absolutely. I think the way I frame it, let's learn from history and put Hong Kong situation into context. I think the international community is facing a Tiananmen Movement 2.0, in which after 1989, after Tiananmen Massacre, the world have to face a choice where should we engage with China and help growth, or should we, apply the pressure and sanction on China, right? And, the world at that point choose to engage economically with China. I think we actually have to make the same choice right now. Do we sacrifice human rights and the long-term development of liberal institutions in cities such as Hong Kong or other cities in mainland China for the sake of just short-term economic growth? Or should we look ahead and say, what's the future of the world should look like? Should we embrace more liberal ideas and democratic ideals? And maybe we should apply more pressure to hold China accountable while we are doing business with China. Otherwise, I think we really hope that the international community this time would make the right choice and hold China accountable to its promises and to all its authoritarian practice. I think you mute yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much. We're running out of time. There's many other points to cover. But in closing, I really want to highlight just a couple of main takeaways from this debate. We shouldn't forget about the bigger picture. Chinese efforts for global hegemony and its divide and rule tactics vis-a-vis the European Union are a big threat. And let's not fall for the potential trap for causing division between the EU and the US on this. The EU, the United States, many other global democracies globally are on the same side in this issue when we talk about Hong Kong. Staying united against autocracy is a must. We also need to defend fundamental human rights and remember that European values are our strength, not our weakness. It's extremely important to involve civil society groups and to continue engagement. I'm really glad that our speakers also reminded us today that we have to be vocal, engaged, and even sanctions should not be off the table. And I'm really happy that we had such a clear and such a strong stance from our speaker from Hong Kong, who is reminding us that maybe a winter of civil society unrest is coming in Hong Kong, a winter of discontent. And there is a clear risk here of a Tiananmen 2.0 in which there is a choice to be made. Do we sacrifice human rights in mainland China, in places like Taiwan or Hong Kong? Do we sacrifice them for economic growth? And the international community has to make a clear stance on this. And if I can wrap up the debate in one sentence, it's the following. The European Union stands with Hong Kong. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the speakers for their comprehensive and excellent contributions. And dear friends, online guests, stay tuned to the Martin Center future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitar, and thank you, dear friends.